Do you have a tight writing schedule, like from morning to noon and the afternoon, or
I like to write in the morning. I like to write when I'm freshest, and I usually feel that I'm written out by 1 or 2 in the afternoon. So if I start at 8, then I go about till about 2. I do something, either a walk, or I used to swim, or I take a nap. I get away from it before I fall asleep. I will go through it again, what I've written that day, and try to figure out in my head and not on paper where I'm going the next day, where the next scene is. If I know exactly what the next scene will be, it'll be easier the next day to get up and start writing again. If I haven't figured that out, it's more difficult. But if it seems, from my experience, if I know the next one, and I can write the next one quickly, then the others will move behind it, right? And I keep that same thing up and the same pattern up, 8 to 2 in the afternoon until I'm done. Now, what seems to have happened in some of these scripts to me is that when I'm in the third draft, and if it's working, I can't stop, and I feel like I'm racing through a tunnel. So I'll write in the afternoon and at night, and I'll be up till 2 in the morning, and I'm just racing through it. But that's only when I see the ending, or glimpse the end. Glimpse is a better word rather than saying glimpse the ending. And I can't wait to get it done because I feel if I delay the process, I'll hurt it. So I have to get it done.
usually how much time does it take to you to write these first 3 drafts?
Writing the first
The first 3 drafts, how much time does it take?
3 drafts. It depends on I would usually, the first 3 drafts get done within 2 or 3 months, depending on how tough it is. There are crazy exceptions like Basic, where it's 13 days. But that was all like, it was all like racing through a tunnel. And I was taking notes all the time at night. I don't like to wake up at 3 in the morning listening to some character talk to me. I said, get away from me, I'm trying to sleep. But it happens sometimes. So.
What would be your advice to writers who are married with children, how not to ruin your relationship? How can you spend quality time with your family when you are working on something?
Well, first of all, I'm married to an Italian woman, okay? She makes sure that I spend time with my family, with my children, and all of that. She understands the Twisted Little Man. I think they made a deal years ago. I'm sure they made a deal years ago. And I like to think, and I try to be a good dad. And that means even when I'm involved with something, doing stuff, being there. We go to many of the high school things. We go to church on the weekends together always. We go to the games, we go to Little League games, and we have 4 boys whom we both like very much. You love your children, but you don't necessarily like them all the time. I'm not saying we like them all the time, but we like them. But parenting is a real challenge. I say it's a high wire act. You can fall off the wire easily. My dad was very involved in Hungarian activities and all of that, and I was crazy about baseball, and he knew that. And so if I got good grades, he took me to the Cleveland Indians games. That screwy thing that Joe is wearing is the Cleveland Indians symbol, So we went to the Cleveland Indians games, and my dad would sit there in his beret and his trench coat while I'm watching the game and read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, right? But he took me. He took me if I got good grades, and it's very important in retrospect. It's not an easy thing to balance. It's especially difficult if you're writing a piece. It's a very dark piece, and you're dealing with all kinds of darkness in the piece, and at this end, and let's say you're writing a piece that's about evil, as I seem to do sometimes, and at the same time, what you have to show to the children you love is a great deal of love, so that the dichotomy is sometimes difficult. But, 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 but one of the, just as writers to you, somebody once wrote, I'm trying to remember which writer, but I don't remember, but he said that the real estimation of a writer's success at the end of his life is not how many movies he's written or how many awards he's gotten or all of those things, but it is at the final moments of his life, who's around him in that bedroom, who's there, and how are they with him there. And I've always tried to live to that. You know, there are a lot of stories about writers who were great writers and who were really awful with their families, and some of the greatest ones, you know, Hemingway, Faulkner, William Saroyan, you know, Steinbeck, you go through them. What took them over was the writing, and then they became obsessed about the writing, and I think that's really what they cared mostly about. I've never wanted that to happen to me, and I wanted to live a broader range life, and I think I have, but sometimes it's not easy.
You usually work without a writing partner. So what happens when you get writer's block? How do you overcome it by yourself?
I have this thing on my desk. It's this gigantic, huge rock. And on it are the words writer's block. Right, that's what it is, it's writer's block. Naomi got it for me. So I take it and throw it over my shoulder and break everything in the room and see if it improves. It doesn't. It doesn't do it. I mean, look, I try to distract myself, and on those occasions, I really do a lot of things with my family to get away from what I've done. It's almost like fleeing it. You know, I focus on some of my personal, you know, hobby-like pursuits. You know, baseball is one of them, so suddenly I focus on the Cleveland Indians and the Yankees and what happens, right? I take Naomi out to lunch more often than usual. And in the back of my head, this thing is spinning about why I'm blocked, right? And this twisted little person I know is working. If nothing else works, and then, you know, a couple of weeks go by, then trying to be fresh, I sit down with it again, and I literally take it from page one and retype it. Just what I've got, I retype it. And in the course of that, I hope to find where I made a mistake, where it all went screwy, right? A lot of times that works. And I realize that I made some bad choices with the characters. And that I have to redo them, and then it springs open. When it doesn't work, you know, then I have no choice but to put it away. I put it in a drawer, and then it's like semi-burying it. You know, and sometimes, you know, in a matter of weeks or months, I realize what's wrong with it. But sometimes I don't, and it stays there, and it dies, right? And I have some of those. It's very painful when that happens.
Okay, regarding building scenes, how do you build up a scene? How do you know when to enter a scene and leave a scene in your scripts?
It's not at all analytical. It's all intuitive. You know, it's all intuitive, and I feel that the scene has been realized, and it's time to move on, or I feel it hasn't, and it needs to be redone, sometimes eliminated, you know. But it's all intuitive. I don't have any rules, or my friend, I don't have any paradigm there, you know. But so I just do it that way, you know.
Do you use any index cards?
I'm sorry?
Do you use any cards with each scene?
Yeah, I use cards. I use cards and as notes primarily, and sometimes I'm able to lay out the next 5 or 6 scenes with cards. But what I mostly use, my first draft is a very rough, scrawled open. I use a manual typewriter, so it's paper and pen, and it's all scrawled around, you know, with notes and everything else, things taken out. It's a mess, the first one, and then the second one improves.
So whenever you start writing dialogues for the characters, how can you avoid for them to sounding the same? How can you make them to have a unique voice?
You have to know, this is why I have character notes. You have to know, I need to know, I need to know backstory. I need to know where they came from. I need to know how old they are exactly, how they look, and in terms of their lives, how they grew to where they are. That distinguishes the voice for me, you know, and the voice comes out of their nature and their character, you know, and the sentences and the language are all a tip off to that. And I know that pretty well in the first draft. In the dialogue rewriting the second draft, then I know it much better, and it's much clearer, and those distinctions then become much more evident and much clearer in the second one.
Do you believe in the saying that show, don't tell?
For the most part, I don't like the kind of piece where you don't know anything about the character. You know, that there's so little revealed that it's not a real person to me, but it's like a cinema person, right? And then you know, it's this protagonist that we don't know anything about. I think that's easy in some ways, and it's much more difficult to fill it in a little bit. I'm not saying you fill it in to the point where you have 3 pages of dialogue about background and history and where they came from and what their lives have been like and all that stuff, because I think that's overkill. But I like to have a little bit of glimpses of who they are, even if they're indirect mirror glimpses. You know, that still would be interesting.
Have you ever been asked to come up and polish a script to rewrite someone else's dialogue?
To rewrite someone else's dialogue?
Yeah.
On rare occasions, I don't like doing it, and I've done it for people who are friends of mine, and it usually comes in the manner of a polish, which means we have 2 weeks to go before we start shooting, and it doesn't work, the dialogue and the characterization, so we'd like you to change some of the dialogue. I was asked to do a dialogue polish years ago on a movie called Blue Thunder with Roy Scheider, and it was directed by John Badham. And so I made the deal with the studio, which is Raystar. And they said, well, how long will this take you? And I said, well, you said 2 weeks, you'll have it in a week. And they said, well, the week is that's pretty fast work. I said, well, you need it quickly. I'm doing a dialogue polish. And they said, well, you know, we don't know what to pay you. So my agents got involved and said, well, we want you to pay him $100,000, right? The studio said, well, that's a week, 5 days, and you know, it's a lot of money. And the studio head was a friend of mine. He was driving this really new, beautiful Jaguar, and he knew I liked his car, so he said, you know, what if we give you a Jaguar, you know, for 5 days of work? And I said, it's a beautiful Jaguar. And my agent said, we can't do that. The guy said, what do you mean you can't do that? It's 5 days of work. And the agency said, what do we get, a tire? Is that our price? You know, so sometimes you make these things, and you know, these things in terms of doing a dialogue polish, but it's not really worth doing. You know, I mean, yes, the Jaguar was nice, you know, but ultimately it's not worth doing that kind of thing. You know.
Yesterday you said that in your first script there was a 15-page long monologue.
Yes.
Do you still do that in a shorter version? Do you still write monologues? Do you like?
I think a monologue, that was my first script, and having written many others, a monologue is very difficult. And just in terms of, less is always more on screen. You know, you could really bore the piss out of an audience, you know, if you do things like that. I wouldn't advise you guys to do 15-page monologues. You know, it's much more interesting to have a scintillating dialogue between two people. Um, the it has to be a really unique piece of work. I mean, Pulp Fiction had some monologues that were lengthy, you know, but I think Tarantino is really very good at that kind of odd kind of thing, and he takes great chances. It can work if it's really well done, but it's very risky.
Yeah, I was about to ask you your opinion on Quentin Tarantino's dialogues. So you just answered this question. You like his dialogues in certain places. What about Aaron Sorkin's dialogue?
Well, you know what Aaron does, I think, he's a very different talent. Aaron writes like the machine gun dialogue of Tracy and Hepburn, that kind of movie, right? Except he does it in a very contemporary way with a much darker subject matter. He's a playwright. He began as a playwright with A Few Good Men. And I think he has a playwright sensibility, as did Patty Chayefsky, who was a playwright too. So the sentences are longer, and the cadences are much more playwright-like than they are the short, pithy things in a screenplay. He's a hugely talented man, as was Patty, and his writing is very explosive, especially because no one else really does it. No one else is willing to take those kind of chances.
So what happens when an actor comes to you and asks to write him some more dialogue? Let's say Al Pacino gives you a call. Hey,
Right.
Joe, I need a long monologue as usual.
Being somewhat experienced after all these years, I say, oh boy, you better talk to the director about that before before we do it. And you know, the actors always sometimes have, you know, a lot of different motivations for asking that don't necessarily have much to do with the success of the movie as a whole, or with the character. You know, sometimes they have much more to do with actors' egos, so it's a very difficult business, and you have to assess it. You know, sometimes the solution is to write really bad dialogue, and then they say, oh no, I can't use that. You know.
So when you write your dialogues, is it part of your research? Let's say when you write about cops or miners, you go down there and listen to their conversations and try to build it into your dialogues?
No, it doesn't come literally. What it comes from is the experience of knowing them as people, knowing how they talk, knowing what their value system is, knowing what their moral compass is, and that makes it easier to write them. But it doesn't have to do with what they've specifically said. It has to do with all of those things I just mentioned, at least for me.